Hey folks, this is Kelani. A new patch for World of Warcraft is on the way, which means new content, new collectibles, and a new round of nerfs. It's pretty typical that at least one class gets a little ahead of themselves in the current season of whatever's going on, whether it's a certain class destroying the DPS meters in the current raid tier, an unstoppable healer who tops the meters no matter what, or a tank who's gotten a bit too big for their boots. There's always going to be some balance changes and tuning with the major patches, and 8.3 is no exception. We have some buffs, a whole lot of nerfs, and some changes to a few Heart of Azeroth essences that we'll touch on as well. Let's jump right in. Oh, and don't forget your tier vials. There's going to be a lot of unhappy chaps about some of these nerfs. The first nerf I want to talk about is probably the largest balance change for patch 8.3. Holy Paladins will see a huge nerf to their artifact trait Glimmer of Light. This trait was previously unchained, unrestricted, but after 8.3 goes live you will be capped at a maximum of 8 Glimmer buffs active at any one time. In a mythic raid you would have had the option of pumping out up to 20 Glimmers if you really wanted to, one for each member of the raid, and then one for the boss too, I guess, so make that 21. So the max potential of this trait has been cut by over half, and you'll have to choose between an extra healing Glimmer of Light buff or sticking one on the boss for that sweet passive DPS. Seeing as pretty much every Holy Paladin has jumped in bed with a Glimmer of Light build, this is sure to shake things up at least a little bit. You won't be able to cover as many raid members as before, you can't freely DPS the boss without a care in the world, you might even have to start using more healing spells than just Holy Shock. Imagine that. Who am I kidding? If Glimmer of Light remains the go-to build for Holy Paladins, that's all you'll be casting anyway. It's such a weird build in my mind. It obviously works incredibly well, don't get me wrong, but I can't help but wonder why it was allowed to get as crazy as it has. The Glimmer of Light trait even received some nerfs before 8.2 went live from what I remember. So this is Glimmer of Light after tuning changes going into this raid tier. Can you imagine what would have happened if it wasn't knocked down a peg or two before the Eternal Palace raid? You'd probably be running all Holy Paladins, and that's not even a joke. A lot of Mythic raiding guilds are already running 2 Holy Paladins for a lot of the fights, some are even running 3 when they can get away with it. The nerfs to the trait before 8.2 also tell me that the dev team realized there was potential here for this to get out of control. They just didn't see the full potential, I guess, because they didn't nerf it anywhere near enough. But I guess that's what this change is going to rectify. Holy Paladins and Disc Priests have been dominating the healing scene this raid tier, so it's not really surprising that Holy Paladins are the first target of the nerf bat, because the Glimmer of Light trait allows them to very efficiently heal the vast majority of any raid group while keeping the tanks alive, and they're kicking out some really solid DPS at the same time. For a healer at any rate, it's no surprise that the Glimmer traits are the main target here. They could have just reduced a Paladin's overall healing done, or remove some interactions between abilities that make Glimmer of Light so strong, but that could have had all sorts of knock-on effects, and I think the last thing Blizzard should be doing is removing interesting trait choices. But Glimmer was so strong because of how many raid members you could cover with it, so by reining in that potential by putting a cap on how many Glimmers you can have out at one time, they don't necessarily change how the build works, they just put a limit on how effective it can be for raid healing. I think it's definitely a required nerf at this point. Holy Paladins were getting a bit out of control. They're not alone though. As I mentioned, Disc Priests have been up there when it comes to healing domination as well, so they're getting a bit of a slap on the wrist with a nerf bat too. Atonement is having another 5% knocked off its healing transfer rate, so instead of 55% of your damage dealt being transferred as healing to anyone with your Atonement active, it's now down to 50% of your damage dealt. I guess Disc Priests just can't catch a break. This is yet another nerf to Atonement. At the start of BfA, it was up at 60% from what I can remember, and because they were doing a little too well back then, they received a pretty hefty round of nerfs, one of which was the Atonement nerf down to 55%. I guess that didn't really stop them all that much because they're one of the better healers for the Eternal Palace raid right now, and as I say, Atonement is getting nerfed yet again. Nothing will probably change too much for a Disc Priest going forward, you just won't be doing as much healing as you were before. Priests will also be seeing another round of nerfs to their only DPS specialization, Shadow. This might put the nail in the coffin for our favourite damage over time DPS. Oh, The Warlocks? Yeah, I guess they're okay. They're no Shadow Priest though. Well, maybe until 8.3. These nerfs are pretty bad. There's another nerf to the Auspicious Spirits talent. The damage bonus has been slashed again, this time down to 25%. So that's been halved again, and kind of just ensures it never gets used outside of mass multi-dot pulls. I guess that's fine, but they didn't stop there. The critical strike bonus from the Chorus of Insanity Azerite trait has been reduced by 25%. That hurts the potential scaling of Shadow Priests going forward. A good chunk of their damage comes from the huge crit rating they get from long duration void forms combined with the Chorus of Insanity, so that's just a straight up damage nerf. I doubt the trait itself will be thrown in the garbage. It's still a really strong trait, especially when you can stack 3 of them. It's just not going to provide as much damage. And to top things off, Shadow Word Pain and Vampiric Touch damage will be reduced by 8%, just in case the other nerfs weren't quite enough. You know, kick them while they're down and all that. Honestly, I thought Shadow Priest would do worse than it did for the Eternal Palace raid with the nerfs that it got before this raid tier started, but you can see from Warcraft logs that it didn't really hinder them all that much. More nerfs for Shadow Priests isn't all too surprising given their dominance on multi-target fights. I just hope they have some chances to shine in the next raid as well. Throwing all of these nerfs in and then having the majority of the new encounters be single target would be devastating for this spec. Another pretty hefty nerf is coming for the Brewmaster Monks. This one isn't all too surprising too. They've been dominating the raid scene as a tank for most of this expansion because they're just so good. Stagger alone makes them an amazing tank choice, but I guess it's a little too strong right now because they're reeling it back in just a touch. The stagger percentage will be reduced to 90% of your agility, down from 105% of your agility. That's not all. The talent High Tolerance will increase the effectiveness of stagger by 5% down from 8%, so a double whammy there for the Brewmaster Monks on their stagger potential. On top of the stagger nerfs, their stamina bonus is getting nerfed from 35% down to 30%, so Brewmasters will also have a little less health going into next patch as well. It's not all bad for the monks though. Windwalker should see some nice buffs if nothing changes. Rising Sun kick damage will be increased by 25%, and Blackout kick's damage will be increased by 10%. Not super crazy buffs, but every little helps when you're a little low on the damage meters. And then to round out the class changes, we have a small nerf to Warlocks. This is only for Affliction locks and it affects the talent Deathbolt. In patch 8.3, Deathbolt will deal damage equal to 20% of the remaining damage on your dots, down from 30%. Apparently Deathbolt was hitting a bit too hard, and the talent was too far ahead of the others on the same row. Maybe this will shake up the talent section a little bit for the Affliction locks out there in 8.3. And we actually have a buff for patch 8.3. There's no trade-offs for this one. Frost mages will be happy to know that Ice Lance damage has been increased by 20%. That should make sure that it's actually worth casting every now and then, and it could help get Frost a little bit ahead on the damage meters. It's probably not going to be significant enough to catch Fire or Arcane next patch, but every little helps, right? Remember that this is still the first build on the public test realm. That means all of these nerfs and buffs are still subject to change. We could see more, we could see less. The numbers could differ quite drastically, and some of the nerfs might be reverted entirely before patch 8.3 goes live. I wouldn't read too much into things right now, but the current changes should give you an idea of where the devs are when it comes to who is performing too well and who needs a little bit of a pick-me-up. Obviously, Holy Paladins and Disc Priests are on their radar for some nerfs, and a few classes are being tweaked around a bit. If your class isn't here, that doesn't mean they won't get any changes. We might just have to wait for a future PTR build. I wouldn't hope for any massive ability or talent changes though, nothing which will actually change a rotation. The dev team has said previously that they'll be waiting until 9.0 and the next expansion to change anything big relating to classes, so it's all numbers tuning for this patch probably. Another system which will be seeing some numbers tuning is the Heart of Azeroth essences. A handful have been marked for buffs in the current PTR build, and for now there aren't any nerfs. I assume there might be a few coming a little bit later. Some essences are still heads and tails above the rest, so they might get knocked down a few notches. Let's have a look at what we know so far. The Purification Protocol essence has had its major power damage increased by about 15%, which might help it keep up with the Focusing Iris just a little more and should help its single target potential. A damage buff is always nice, but one of the interesting things about the Purification Protocol was its potential to immediately destroy targets. It's a low chance, sure, but when it happens it's pretty hilarious. The problem was that it didn't always work, or more specifically, the dev team made sure so it can't happen in raid or dungeon encounters. Well, that's no fun now, is it? The dev team seems to agree, because in patch 8.3, that chance to instantly kill a random target will now also work in raids and dungeons. I assume that's never going to work on a boss, but still, it might still insta-give some of the problematic adds in one of the raid fights or blow away some pesky mobs while fighting a dungeon boss. I'll be interested to see how many people decide to pick this up and try out in 8.3. The low chance and reliance on RNG probably isn't worth it, but it could still be really funny if the essence carries a raid to victory. Unbound Force still hasn't been seeing much use because it's a little lackluster in almost every sense, but 8.3 might change that. The major power has had its damage increased by 40%, and the minor power that grants you a crazy amount of crit has had its duration increased. It now starts at 4 seconds, up from 3, and with the rank 3 essence the buff will last for 6 seconds, up from 4. So just an all-round decent buff for the Unbound Force. The World Vein Resonance will join the ranks of buffed up essences too. This one is a little different. Instead of just buffing the value of the essence and its passive effects, like increasing the number on the primary stat gain for the passive effect, they're going to increase the value of the major power. Now when you use the major power, you'll gain an additional 50% bonus of primary stats from every lifeblood shard for 10 seconds. If multiple people are using the World Vein Resonance, you're almost guaranteed to get the maximum value out of it every time you use the major ability, and if you line that up with some cooldowns, you could get some nice damage rolling. They're also changing how the Vitality Conduit essence works. I think it should heal for quite a bit more, and it's apparently going to be more visually impactful so you can see the healing. And to finish up, the Vision of Perfection essence will have its proc rate increased by 12%. So for everyone already using that essence, that should be a pretty nice buff. As I said earlier, we don't have any nerfs for the essences right now, so I assume we'll see some of those later on in the PTR cycle. We're still early days, so anything could change from here until patch 8.3 goes live. I'm not too sure how much longer we'll have the PTR for 8.3. They could release the patch early December and allow us to work our way through the non-raid content, all of the assaults and visions and whatnot, and then release the raid in the new year. Or they might just wait until the new year to give us a fresh patch in a brand new year. Either way, I don't think we'll be waiting much longer than January at the very latest for 8.3 to launch, so we still have a couple of months worth of testing on the public test realm, which means a couple months for everything to change. What do you think of the buffs and nerfs we've seen so far? Did Glimmer Paladins deserve the hefty nerf, or do you think that was a bit heavy-handed? Are there any classes you would love to see some major buffs for? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.